America, are you okay? A hypothetical Canadian kerfuffle. Imagine, if you will, the United States deciding, for reasons presumably involving a national shortage of maple syrup or a sudden inexplicable craving for poutine, to invade Canada. Yes, Canada. Our friendly, polite, hockey-loving neighbor to the north. It sounds like the plot of a terrible action movie, possibly starring a confused grizzly bear and a surprisingly agile moose. But, as utterly bonkers as it sounds, it's a hypothetical that, believe it or not, people have actually thought about. So, let's put on our tinfoil hats just for a moment and dive into this geopolitical thought experiment. Now, before anyone in Washington starts getting any bright ideas, let me be clear, this is purely speculative. We are exploring a what-if scenario that is, frankly, about as likely as me winning an Olympic gold medal and competitive apologizing, an event Canada would dominate anyway. But the question remains, if the US military, with all its might, decided to head north, how long could Canada realistically resist? It's a question that involves military strength, geography, international relations, and a whole lot of, ooh, that's awkward. The very idea of the US invading Canada is on its face preposterous. We share the longest undefended border in the world. Our economies are deeply intertwined. We're allies in NATO. Culturally, we're like siblings who occasionally bicker over who gets the remote, but ultimately know we're family. An invasion would be like punching yourself in the face repeatedly, while also setting fire to your own house. So buckle up, grab a double-double, and let's consider how our northern neighbors might fare if Uncle Sam truly lost his marbles and decided to march on Ottawa. Let's get one thing straight right out of the gate. In a conventional, head-to-head military conflict, Canada versus the United States is not exactly a fair fight. The US military budget is, to put it mildly, substantial. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars annually, and millions of active and reserve personnel. Canada, on the other hand, has a military that is, shall we say, more modestly proportioned. Their defense spending is a fraction of the US figure. While the Canadian armed forces are professional and well-trained, they are simply not equipped to repel a full-scale invasion. Think of it this way. The US military has more marching bands than Canada has tanks. The disparity in equipment is stark. The US fields thousands of main battle tanks. Canada has a few dozen. The US Air Force boasts thousands of combat aircraft. The Royal Canadian Air Force has a much smaller fleet. The story is similar at sea. The US Navy's carrier strike groups alone possess more firepower than many entire navies. Canada's Navy, while skilled, doesn't have the power to stop a determined US advance. So, if we're talking about a straight-up conventional war, Canada's chances of stopping a US invasion are, to be blunt, virtually nil. History has some wonderfully awkward skeletons in its closet. In the 1920s, the US had a plan to invade Canada called War Plan Red. It was part of color-coded plans for potential conflicts with nations. The plan detailed routes targeting cities like Halifax and Toronto. Canada had its own counterplan, Defense Scheme No. 1 by Lieutenant Colonel Buster Brown. It involved a preemptive invasion of the US, targeting cities like Seattle. Today, the US and Canada are close allies, not adversaries. These plans are relics, like dusty maps showing dragons. So, the unthinkable happens. American tanks are rolling, jets are screaming overhead. What does Canada do in those initial, horrifying hours and days? Well, first, there would likely be a collective national gasp, followed by a frantic search for the Prime Minister's emergency contact number for the US President, probably labeled "Do Not Call Unless Moose Uprising." Realistically, Canada's initial military response would be focused on damage control, delaying actions, and attempting to preserve as much of its fighting capability as possible. They know they can't win a conventional slugfest. The strategy would be to make any advance as costly and slow as possible. This would involve deploying their forces strategically, likely abandoning any attempt to hold the entire 8,891-kilometer border. That's just not feasible. Instead, they would concentrate on defending key urban centers, critical infrastructure like power plants and transportation links, and perhaps trying to establish defensive lines along natural obstacles like rivers or rugged terrain. The Canadian Army, though small, is well trained in operating in challenging environments, including their own harsh winters. They would try to leverage this home field advantage, making invaders pay for every inch of ground, even if those inches are inevitably lost. Ultimately, Canada's initial conventional defense would be a fighting retreat. Alright, so conventional resistance is, let's be honest, a bit of a short-term prospect for Canada. But what about the long game? What about turning the vast, often inhospitable Canadian landscape into a quagmire for an occupying force? This is where the discussion shifts to guerrilla warfare and insurgency. Canada is the second largest country in the world by land area. It has immense forests, rugged mountains, sprawling tundra, and notoriously harsh winters. This is not ideal terrain for a conventional army trying to control a resentful population. Think Afghanistan, but with more snow and fewer goats probably. A prolonged insurgency in Canada could be a nightmare for any occupying power, even one as mighty as the United States. The Canadian population, while generally peaceful, has a strong sense of national identity. If their country were invaded, it's reasonable to assume that a significant portion would resist. This resistance wouldn't necessarily be uniformed soldiers, it would be ordinary citizens, potentially supplied by sympathetic elements of the now fragmented Canadian Armed Forces, or even by other nations who see an opportunity to bog down the US. The sheer size of the country would make it incredibly difficult to police effectively. Imagine small mobile units of Canadian irregulars, familiar with the local terrain, conducting hit-and-run attacks on supply lines, patrols, and isolated outposts. They could leverage Canada's challenging climate, especially in winter, to their advantage. An occupying force would face constant harassment, the threat of improvised explosive devices, IEDs, and the difficulty of distinguishing friend from foe in a population that largely looks and sounds like them. An unprovoked US invasion of Canada wouldn't happen in a vacuum. The rest of the world would, to put it mildly, have some thoughts. And those thoughts would likely be expressed with a mixture of disbelief, outrage, and a flurry of emergency UN Security Council meetings. Canada is a G7 nation, a founding member of NATO, and generally considered one of the good guys on the international stage. Attacking them would be a flagrant violation of international law and a betrayal of decades of alliance and friendship. The diplomatic fallout would be catastrophic for the United States. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, would face an existential crisis. Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause, states that an attack on one member is an attack on all. Now, the US is NATO in many respects, but an American attack on Canada, that would tear the alliance apart. European allies, the UK and others would be forced to condemn their most powerful partner. Would they impose sanctions on the US? Would they offer material support to Canada? It's hard to say, but the alliance as we know it would likely shatter. The geopolitical ramifications would be immense, potentially emboldening actual US adversaries like Russia or China. Economically, the consequences would be severe. The US and Canadian economies are deeply integrated. An invasion would disrupt supply chains, halt trade worth billions daily, and send financial markets into a tailspin. International sanctions against the US, even if limited, would further damage its economy. Domestically, within the United States, such an action would be incredibly divisive. Protests would erupt, political opposition would be fierce. The idea of American soldiers fighting and dying to occupy Canada would be abhorrent to a vast number of Americans. The moral authority of the US on the world stage would be utterly shredded. And then, there's the simple human element. So, let's try to answer the original question: how long could Canada resist a US invasion? Conventionally, in a straight-up military fight, the answer is likely not very long. Days, perhaps weeks, before major cities are occupied and the Canadian government is forced to capitulate or go into exile. The US military machine is simply too powerful, too large, and too technologically advanced for Canada to stop through conventional means. Air superiority would be achieved quickly, followed by rapid ground advances across the relatively open border regions where most Canadians live. It would be a swift, brutal, and deeply tragic affair. However, resistance doesn't just mean conventional warfare. As we've discussed, a prolonged insurgency or guerrilla campaign is a very real possibility. In that scenario, Canada could resist for years, possibly decades. The US could find itself bogged down in a vast, difficult-to-control country facing a hostile population and international condemnation. The cost in lives, resources, and global standing would be astronomical. Victory in the conventional sense, seizing territory, would be achievable. But winning the peace and successfully occupying Canada long-term? That's an entirely different and far more difficult proposition. It would be a Pyrrhic victory at best. The ultimate winner in such a scenario is, frankly, no one. Canada would suffer immense destruction, loss of life, and the trauma of occupation. The United States would face international pariah status, a shattered global order, massive economic disruption, and deep internal divisions. The very fabric of North American stability and cooperation would be torn asunder. Alliances would crumble. The world would become a much more dangerous and unpredictable place. This entire exercise, of course, remains firmly in the realm of the highly improbable, the wildly speculative.